Would you please talk about what Jung referred to as a psychic death, also called an ego death?
Now, there's variants of that because you can have a voluntary or an involuntary ego death. And a voluntary ego death is when you learn a bunch and you're willing to let go. So that would be your own immolation. It's like you're a phoenix and you're lighting yourself on fire. That's a much better idea, even though it can still be really harsh. The involuntary ego deaths, they're really hard on people. People will do almost anything to stop that from happening. That ego death is a journey into the underworld, or it's a collapse into chaos. And that's not so bad if you do it purposefully. But in the Pinocchio story, for example, that's exemplified by Pinocchio going down to the depths to rescue his father from the whale. Now, he does that voluntarily, but it damn near kills him, right? I mean, first of all, he hardly gets out of the whale. Second, it's a journey to the depths, so it's a journey to the underworld. It's the consequence of a collapse in previous personality and the disintegration of that previous personality into a chaotic state prior to rebirth. And so then what that would imply is that if you got to the point where you could look at the darkest things, so that would be the abyss, right? That would be the deepest abyss. If you could look at the harshest things, like the most brutal parts of the suffering of the world and the malevolence of people and society, if you could look at that straight and directly, that would turn you on maximally. Because imagine that you're like the potential composite of all the ancestral wisdom that's locked inside of you biologically. But that's not going to come out at all unless you stress yourself, unless you challenge yourself. And the bigger the challenge you take on, the more that's going to turn on. And so that as you take on a broader and broader range of challenges and you push yourself harder, then more and more of what you could be turns on, and that's equivalent to transforming yourself into the ancestral father. I think you can think about it religiously too. So you think about it this way. So in the Christian story, for example, you have Christ does two things that are messianic. One is takes the suffering of the world onto himself. Because that's a weird idea. Okay, so what does that mean? Let's think about it psychologically. Well, maybe it means that, that's your job. Is the world's full of suffering, and you should accept that as your responsibility, past, present, and future. You're supposed to do something about that, as much as you can about it. And maybe you start with your own localized suffering, and so you accept that as a responsibility. So that's part of taking on a load. That's part of bearing a cross. You could look at it that way. The cross is sort of a symbol of the place of maximal suffering. Okay, so you accept that as a challenge, not as something that you're victimized by. Maybe you accept that as the price of being. Okay, so that's one responsibility. You're responsible for addressing the suffering in the world. So that could give you some meaning, seems to me. And then the next thing is, there's a story, of course, that Christ met the devil in the desert. And so that's the encounter with malevolence. So that would be the other thing, because the major problems that people face, obviously, are suffering, tragedy, and malevolence. And so that's the other thing that you're responsible for, is that you're supposed to look at the capacity for human evil as clearly as you possibly can. It's a very terrifying thing. That causes post-traumatic stress disorder in people that aren't accustomed to it. But the idea would be that if you can face the malevolence and you can face the suffering, then that maximally opens the door to your maximal potential. And then the optimistic part of that is that although the suffering is great and the malevolence is deep, your capacity to transcend it is stronger. So what you get out of the most negative viewpoint is the most positive possible consequence. Because one of the things you'd like to know, if you wanted to know something deep about yourself, is that you could face the worst that there was and prevail. I believe that people are capable of that. I think that despite how tragic life is and how malevolent things are, that fundamentally our spirit, let's say, has the capacity to confront that and to fix it, like psychologically, to confront it courageously, to be able to bear up under that if you do it voluntarily, but also to address it. Not only to deal with it psychologically, but to deal with it practically. And that we could make things much better.